Hello and welcome to this video. It's the continuation in my series on GCSE English Literature. Everything you see comes from the ebook, which you can pick up for just £3.99 at mrbruff.com or amazon.co.uk, so please do pick up a copy. So in today's video I want to have a look at one of the assessment objectives from the exam. The literature exam assessment objectives are AO1, 2, 3 and 4. What I want to look at today is AO3, understand the context in which texts were written. Now the term context can be understood in a variety of ways and it's going to vary depending upon which text you're studying. Context can mean when the text was written, when and where the text was set, the literary context and genre, or responses from different audiences. But let's begin with thinking about the events and circumstances that surround when a text was written. And we're going to have a look, as an example, at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So Frankenstein was written in the early 1800s at a time of great social and historical change. In the 1760s, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Émile explored the nature of education and human beings. And in this text, the writer argues that humans are born harmless and that it's society which makes people either good or bad. Today we might call this the nature-nurture debate, and it's certainly one of the major themes in Frankenstein. Now Frankenstein is a horror book, and to make something truly scary, to make it truly horrific, it needs to tap into the fears of its readers. Mary Shelley was brilliant at this. In order to create a truly terrifying book, Mary Shelley based the foundations of her tale on a recent scientific development which had been frightening the public, called Galvanism. This guy here, Luigi Galvani, was a scientist who experimented on dead animals with electricity, and he found that the limbs of animals could be caused to spasm if they were touched with an electric current. Giovanni Aldini, Galvani's nephew, took these experiments one step further and tried them out on the body of a human being. In 1803, a man named George Foster murdered his wife and child and was hanged for the crime. And shortly after the hanging, Aldini took the body and experimented on it with electricity. This is what he wrote about what happened. On the first application of the process to the face, the jaws of the deceased criminal began to quiver, and the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye was actually opened. In the subsequent part of the process, the right hand was raised and clenched, and the legs and thighs were set in motion. Now, as you can see, this is very similar to the description in the novel Frankenstein, where in chapter 5 we read, "By the glimmer of the half-extinguished light I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs." So the similarities between what was going on in real life and what takes place in the novel are uncanny, even down to the opening of just one eye. Mary Shelley based the ideas in her novel on real-life events, the experimentation of electricity with dead bodies, and this made the novel extremely terrifying, as readers would worry that what happened in the novel, where the creature goes on an unstoppable murderous rampage, was going to happen in real life too. And it could be argued that this is why the novel is still so popular. Today we experiment with cloning, stem cell research, artificial intelligence, robots, and behind it all there's a fear that the results of our creation are going to overpower us and cause chaos and devastation. But it's important to realise then what was going on at the time a writer was writing a book. Okay, there's a simple example with reference to Frankenstein. But sometimes a writer is going to choose to set their text in a different historical period to the one in which they're writing. And when this happens, we need to ask ourselves why they've done this. Let's explore this idea further. Let's look at J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Calls, which was written in 1945 but set in 1912. Now this text is part of paper 2 in the literature exam for AQA, but I'm going to explore it in this video series because the context is so important. We can highlight the contextual details like this, and this table comes from my guide to an inspector calls, also available at mrbruff.com. So we need to think about when a book is, or a text is set at a different time to when it's written, we need to think about both time periods. We need to think about what was going on when it was written and what was going on when it was set. So An Inspector Calls is set in 1912. The First World War is yet to start, and Berling's view that the Germans don't want war is known to be incorrect by all audience members, as the play wasn't performed until 1946. But then we jump forward to 1945, where World War II ended in 1945. People were recovering from nearly 6 years of warfare, danger and uncertainty. So the context there is really important, because as an audience watching in 1945, 1946, they know that Berling was wrong in the 1912 setting of the play to say, well, the Germans don't want war. And he also said other things, didn't he? The Titanic was unsinkable. Lots of things were said in the play that the audience in 1945 would know were now proven to be incorrect, and therefore it undermines the character of Mr. Berling. You can read more on that in the ebook, but basically the gist of it is, in 1912 when the play is set, the ruling classes saw no need for change. They were keen to stay in power. And the Berlings, a wealthy family, represent others of similar social status. They're heavily criticised by Priestley in the play, via the role of the inspector, as they initially take no responsibility for their actions and the effects they have on others. An audience at the time, from 1946 right up to today, are aware that a family such as the Berlings would soon hear about the sinking of the Titanic and would then have to endure 2 world wars. So in this case, Priestley, having witnessed 2 world wars which he fought in to save society, questions what kind of society people were fighting to save. The very idea of society suggests a group working together and looking out for one another, taking social responsibility. Seeing characters before the wars provides some hope to Priestley's audience, who'd been through a very difficult period. And the attitude of the Berlings and the way they're so quick to dismiss any involvement with the unpleasant nature of Eva's suicide would no doubt speak to an audience at the time who'd lived through the results of such complacency. An audience in the late 40s would still be deprived of many of the luxuries the Berlings were enjoying at the beginning of the play, as rationing continued into the 1950s, so the wealthy Berlings can be seen as materialistic and superficial. And of course, Priestley may well have set his play in 1912 because it started a time of great change. In the period between the 2 dates, class and gender differences were not so pronounced, and there was hope for a better future if young people could be educated and take responsibility for their actions and the treatment of others. So that's thinking about when a text is set and when a text is written, and if that has a difference to when it was set. But what about where a text is set? Once we understand when it was written and when it is set, it might be helpful to look at where it takes place. Often a writer will set their text in a different place to that in which they live, and it's quite interesting to think about why they do that. It could be that the writer is criticising the society in which they live, but wants to make their criticism subtle and less obvious by distancing themselves from the action. In Percy Shelley's poem Ozymandias, the poet criticises King George III, but he sets his poem in the distant land of Egypt, supposedly criticising the pharaoh Ozymandias. And Shelley begins the poem by detaching himself from the story being told, because he wants to immediately make the point, look, this isn't an open criticism of the British monarchy. However, we know the poem is a thinly veiled attack. Sometimes there are numerous reasons for a foreign setting. With Shakespeare plays, settings often reflect the source of a text. Romeo and Juliet is set in Verona in Italy, and The Merchant of Venice, I forget where that's set. Oh no, Venice. Now why is that? Some students assume that Shakespeare created the storylines of his plays, but the truth is that it was often someone else who came up with the original plot. In the case of Romeo and Juliet, it was the Italian writer Matteo Bandello in 1480 to 1562 who created what we now know as Romeo and Juliet. It went through a whole stage of being translated into poetry and a novel in English and eventually the play. So it's possible that Shakespeare set Romeo and Juliet in Italy because that's where the story originated. But also the setting of Italy makes sense for the story. Italy was known as a romantic city, just like Paris is known today. The streets are narrow, which creates the perfect intense setting for street fights, and the weather is hot, which will raise the tension and violence in the characters as the quote, "their blood runs hot." But what if Shakespeare is using the play to criticise elements of Elizabethan England? Now, I go through this in my guide to Romeo and Juliet, but the play can be read, in one example, as a scathing criticism of Catholicism. England had only just become a Protestant nation, so perhaps Shakespeare felt it would be too controversial to set such a powerful attack in his native country. And similarly, the play can be seen to criticise the English ritual of arranged marriage, which was prevalent, of course, in the upper classes. Once again, perhaps Shakespeare did not wish to so openly attack the conventions of his own country, so he detached it from England through its foreign setting. When Capulet calls his daughter a wretch for refusing to marry Paris, Shakespeare is clearly pointing an accusatory finger at English fathers. In the 1500s, arranged marriages were normal for upper-class families, acceptable for your parents to choose who you married. So you could say that Shakespeare uses a foreign setting to distance himself from complete open criticism of Elizabethan England. The Merchant of Venice is another Shakespeare play where we can ask ourselves, why choose the foreign setting? Just like Romeo and Juliet, it is a story which Shakespeare did not himself create. The 14th century writer Sir Giovanni wrote Il Pecorone way before Shakespeare was born, and that's a story of a rich young man who travels to Belmont to meet a rich widow, wants to win her over, borrows money from a Jewish moneylender, which is eventually paid for with a pound of flesh. Yeah, it seems clear. One explanation for the Venetian setting is the fact that the story originated there. And it also, like Romeo and Juliet, ties in neatly with the plot. In Elizabethan England, Venice was a key trading centre. Exotic goods were traded in the city, which was home to the explorer Marco Polo, among others. So Venice is a great setting for a story where trade and commerce is essential. But it's also possible that Shakespeare set the play in Venice to distance himself slightly from the criticism of England that we can find within the play. The Merchant of Venice contains many themes, but one is the treatment of Jews. Now, in Shakespeare's time, Jews had been banished from England, and one interpretation is that Shakespeare uses the play to attack the unjust treatment of the Jews. When Shylock asks, "If you prick us, do we not bleed?" it's easy to hear the voice of Shakespeare challenging his audience with the fact that Jews are no different to them. Another key theme in The Merchant of Venice is again the role of parent and child. Even after his death, Portia's father controls who she's going to marry, and when Portia asks Nerissa, "Isn't it a pain I can't choose or refuse anyone?" it's once again easy to hear the echo of Shakespeare's own challenge to the audience, just as we found in Romeo and Juliet. Now, whatever conclusions we draw, it is important to ask ourselves, where is the text set and why is this important? So what we've gone through in this video, when you're reading a text, think about when was it written and what was going on at that time. When is it set and what was going on at that time? Where was it set and why might that be important? Now, in the next video, I'll look at why context is so important. But in this video, I've explained some of the ways you can analyse or certainly think about the context of your text.